podcast. I'm your host, Ben Anderson.
I'm Chandler Holt.
We are recording a very special live version of the Jazz Notes podcast. Appreciate everyone who is joining us on Twitter, who's going to be joining us, or if you are not listening to this live, those of you who are listening to it on however you get your podcast, whatever. Yeah, I don't care. However you do it, we appreciate you doing it.
We are recording this right now at 12:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the end of the 2025 NBA trade deadline. The Jazz have been relatively quiet, but we're going to talk about all things Jazz, all things NBA trades today.
Yeah, 15 minutes left. Like you said, there could be a lot of deals still to be done. Generally, when you get to this point, it's not like big blockbuster trades. Those get agreed to a little bit earlier in the day generally, and you recognize like, hey, you know, we're not going to wait until 12:50 to trade Kevin Durant.
Yeah.
Most likely. Now, it can happen, but usually at this point, it's like what the Atlanta Hawks are doing. They're just trading all of their salary away right now, and the Jazz still have the ability to facilitate some of those cost-cutting trades for other teams. So I would keep an eye on that. Appreciate, again, all of you following us. We are doing this live from the KSL Sports Twitter account. You can find me on Twitter at Ben's Hoops. Find Chandler at C Holt Sports. We're also on Blue Sky over there. We usually record Jazz Notes on Tuesdays, or on Mondays, excuse me. We release the article corresponding with it on Tuesdays. If you've never listened to the Jazz Notes podcast before, first of all, welcome. We'd love to have you listening every week. But we like to go through mailbag questions. We like to address everything that's happening with the Jazz for the week, but this is a special live version for the trade deadline, so we're not really necessarily looking at it that way. We didn't talk at all about how we want to do this.
Yes.
Which was our mistake. Do you want to go over some of the questions we've had, or do you want to address what's just happened with the Jazz so far in the trade deadline, starting with what's happened most recently and working our way backwards?
Yeah, I say we start with overall trade deadline talk, but first I will say for those in spaces, if you want to ask us a question, Ben put out a prompt on his Twitter account at Ben's Hoops. So if you want to ask us a question, leave a reply down there and we can probably get to it.
Yeah, good advice. At Ben's Hoops, you'll see it. It's my last tweet. I will respond to those, or we'll respond to those in the show.
Let's get just into NBA-wide trade talk. The most recent trade, other than a Cody Zeller trade that was just announced, a bigger one, Bogdanovich plus picks to the Atlanta Hawks. The Atlanta Hawks trade them to the Clippers for Bones Highland and Terrence Mann.
Yeah.
Interesting trade.
Yeah, the Hawks are in like cost-cutting mode because clearly they were going for Brandon Ingram last night and it didn't work out for them. So they are moving backwards. Let's focus on the Jazz.
Jazz first? Okay.
And yeah, I think we can get into some of the bigger NBA spaces and NBA conversations there. The Jazz last night were a part of the big move for Jimmy Butler. The Jazz have been involved in every major trade so far. They have been the most active team. Maybe now Atlanta has jumped them. But the Jazz are, in fact, we're getting some news now. Dennis Schroeder, I know this is live. Dennis Schroeder is going to be headed to the Detroit Pistons.
Okay.
Sources tell Jake Fisher and Chris Haynes and Omari Sankofa, who also writes for the Pistons. So we will keep an eye where that is. Dennis Schroeder is being rerouted to the Detroit Pistons as part of the Jimmy Butler deal. So you could conceivably cut the Jazz out of this entirely, other than they've already traded P.J. Tucker, and P.J. Tucker has been rerouted to Atlanta. But again, none of this stuff necessarily has to be solid, so we will keep an eye on these details as they continue to come out. Again, Detroit did have the ability to take on some salary, and if they keep their salary, they can try and get better. They are making a run for the playoffs this year for the first time. So it looks like the Jazz will have an ability to maybe even pick up another asset from Detroit in this. Detroit doesn't have like awesome pieces that you're trying to get, and nor was Dennis Schroeder going to get you some major piece. So again, we will keep an eye on what ends up happening here in this trade and keep you up to date. But it looks like the Jazz are at least involved in another deal, if not just expanding the previous trade from last night, where they did get Dennis Schroeder in exchange for P.J. Tucker. Jazz also got a second-round draft pick, according to Tony Jones. It'll be coming up in 2031.
Yeah.
So 2031 draft pick for the Jazz. So far at the trade deadline, the Jazz have acquired 4 second-round picks and Jalen Hood-Schifino. The reason Jalen didn't play last night is because the Jazz didn't know if he was still going to be in Salt Lake City. So you wait to see if you have traded him, and that's still the case. You could still trade him in the next 10 minutes if you felt like that salary was useful. If not, I would kind of think he shows up. I would think he shows up and plays. So there might actually be a tangible asset that you get to see here in Utah, even though I technically know their next few games are on the road. You might actually get to see a player show up here.
Kind of interesting. Both of the last 2 years, the Jazz were more or less sellers at the deadline and got rid of some rotation pieces. But this year, like Drew Eubanks was the biggest rotation piece. And even then, there were nights where he was a DNP coach's decision. What do you think about the lack of player movement for the Jazz?
The player movement occurred in the offseason.
Yes.
When they didn't go out and get a bunch of veterans that they could hope to trade. And it just so happens that the ones that they did get, namely Drew Eubanks, they traded already.
Yes.
So like in years past, you had guys like Jared Vanderbilt that you had to move. You wanted to move off of Malik Beasley or you wanted to move off of Kelly Olynyk, especially because those guys had expiring contracts. None of these guys really have expiring contracts for the Jazz. And the nice thing even about a guy like John Collins, who if John decided he wanted to opt out of his contract, first of all, the Jazz have, I'm sure, already had conversations with him about what that would look like. If he is going to opt out, is there a team he'd rather go to first before he gets to that opt-out spot? And if not, what type of money is he looking for? Because if he wants to opt out of his deal and get a long-term contract, the Jazz should talk about that too because they have the first access to talk to him about it. So if he wants to renegotiate and do 3 years and 60 as opposed to 26 or whatever it is next year, there could be some sense in that if the Jazz had opted to make that decision. So I'm sure they have had those types of conversations, but no, there's not really the urgency to make trades this year that they had in years past. And because they already only have, 12 after last night, 12 wins after last night, like they're fine. They're set up to be bad in the second half of the season because they were bad in the first half of the season, whereas each of the last 2 years they were basically at 500 at this point.
As mentioned, the Jazz were sort of a facilitator for a lot of these trades. They helped with the Luka Doncic trade. They only gave up cash to both teams, got back Jalen Hood-Schifino, as we mentioned, and 2 second-round picks.
Shams has added that the Jazz are sending Schroeder to Detroit. And the only reason I bring that up, even though we just mentioned it, is that it now looks like it's a Jazz-Detroit deal as opposed to kind of redirecting how this is working, that Dennis Schroeder isn't just jumping the Jazz entirely. There is going through the Jazz, which means the Jazz are probably expecting to get something back, I would assume.
Maybe more second-round picks?
Unless the Jazz were just saying like, hey, and I'd have to look at Detroit's deal or a salary cap here. If Detroit could just take him into space, conceivably the Jazz could give Detroit a pick and say like, hey, we don't want to pay him $4 million. You buy this pick from us basically for $4 million because you're going to pay his buyout, or you're just going to keep him.
Yeah.
Detroit, I would imagine, probably keeps him, but the Jazz just say like, hey, we didn't want to spend all this money on a buyout. But I don't think that makes sense. So we'll see. We'll see what the Jazz end up getting in this deal if they get something at all. It could be very minor.
Do you want to talk about other NBA trades that may affect the Jazz a little bit?
And we can, I think we can. I think we've addressed. The Jazz got 4 second-round picks, and that's solid work already. I talked about this today a little bit on my show. I do the Jake and Ben show, 97.5. KSL Sports from 10 to noon every day. But, the Jazz didn't get rich at this trade deadline. Like, there's no huge blockbuster that they made so far. Again, we have 7 minutes left or whatever of the trade deadline, so they certainly don't have to be done yet necessarily. But what I would say is they kind of traded all their $5 bills for $10 bills. Yeah. It's like, you know what I mean? You just have a couple of loose dollars rolling around in your pocket. If you can flip those and double them, you've improved yourself. And maybe you didn't improve on the court, but you improved your assets. And you've always got to be making the franchise better. I think that has to be your goal. And I think the Jazz have already achieved that regardless of what happens in the next couple of minutes.
So getting into other NBA trades, I would say the biggest one regarding affecting the Jazz, even though the Utah was not a part of it in any way, was the Cavs trading with the Atlanta Hawks for DeAndre Hunter. For the longest time, the Cavs have had their guard set, and they've had their big set, and then they've sort of had a rotating door, and the main face of that door was Isaac Okoro, who, nothing against Isaac Okoro, but that was by far their weakest position. But they filled that with DeAndre Hunter, who has been good for Atlanta this year.
Yeah, he has. He's having the best year of his career. He's at like 19 points a game and shooting almost 40% from the three-point line. This is an interesting spot for the Jazz because you're right, it does slightly affect them because the Jazz, while they did trade their least valuable picks in 2027 and 2029, they've already given up on the 2025 pick, and that will be the Cavaliers pick. So it doesn't really impact them this year. They do still have swap rights in 2026 and 2028 with the Cavaliers, and they have those potential to swap or to just take those first-round picks. They'll just take their picks in 27 and 29. The least valuable between Cleveland, the Jazz, and Minnesota is going to go to Phoenix after that first-round swap. So by doing that, I think the Jazz have ensured themselves pretty well that, like, if Cleveland falls apart, which I don't think is all that likely, especially not before 2027 because these guys are all under contract, but as Cleveland starts to more heavily value 2025 and their run this year because they may feel like, hey, this is our best window, it's open, or maybe it's 2025 and 2026, then you end up in a spot where maybe in 2027 or 2028, they are starting to fall apart a little bit. 2029, they're starting to fall apart a little bit. And the Jazz do still own those draft picks because, again, they're just not going to have the worst of the 3 picks between their own Minnesota and Cleveland. So it's interesting. Anytime a team starts to go for it, Phoenix really went for it 2 years ago. They traded out all of their assets to go and get Kevin Durant, and then they doubled down with Bradley Beal. If Cleveland were to do that and this DeAndre Hunter trading was the, maybe first sign that this was happening, maybe by the time you get to the back end of this deal, the Jazz are feeling pretty good about that Cavaliers pick.
Another trade just broken by Shams. The Memphis Grizzlies are trading Marcus Smart and a 2025 first-round pick to the Wizards in a multi-team trade that sends 2 second-round picks to Memphis. Basically a roster flexibility move for the Grizzlies. I guess we will see more what the other aspects of that multi-team trade are.
Again, this could impact the Jazz because in the last 24 hours, the Wizards have acquired Chris Middleton and Marcus Smart. It's like those guys are actually capable of helping you win games. And I'm not pretending these are great players, but like Kyle Kuzma, who just got traded to Milwaukee yesterday, he's just like in the right spot. I think Kyle Kuzma is valuable. If he's in the wrong spot, which was the Washington Wizards, he's not going to help you win at all.
Yeah.
But like if Marcus Smart plays and wants to play, and maybe he just never does because he's not playing for Memphis either, but if he gets healthy and plays and Chris Middleton stays healthy and plays, those guys might accidentally win them 3 games. And by the way, Washington has won 3 straight, right? They've won 3 in a row, and now they are only 3 wins back of the Jazz. If the Jazz really let the basement fall out here, the bottom fall out, and Washington just says, hey, we just wanted to finish in the bottom 3 picks. We don't want to lose every game, but we do want to be in the bottom 3, so our odds stay the same of getting one of those top 3 or 4 picks. I could see them actually winning a couple of games and maybe leaping the Jazz in the standings, which means the Jazz, if they finish with the worst record, could fall no further than 5th overall, even if worst case scenario everyone jumped them.
I was about to say there is value in having the worst record as opposed to the 2nd and 3rd, even though you have the same chances at the number 1 overall pick. The Pistons are proof that you can fall to 5 multiple years in a row. And in a draft where you're looking at the top 4, maybe 5 prospects, of course, Cooper Flagg stands above all, that there is value there.
Just to reset, we are hosting a live Jazz Notes podcast right now. I appreciate if you are listening to this not live. We're just kind of recapping the things as they come in these last 5 minutes, 3 minutes now. It really comes pretty fast and furious. So appreciate everyone who is tuning in and listening to us on the KSL Sports feed right now on Twitter or X. Another trade just went down. According to Sham Charania, the Milwaukee Bucks are acquiring Kevin Porter Jr. for Marjon Beauchamp. Kevin Porter Jr., remember, had the horrible domestic assault issues, got signed by the Clippers. They were a little bit desperate. Clippers have been good. Not because of him by any means. They've had some nice performances this year, and now that they're getting healthier, they trade him basically for an expiring contract. Beauchamp is a former first-round draft pick who's never really materialized, but potentially adds a little bit of a scoring punch for Milwaukee getting Porter and a little bit of defense for the Clippers. Beauchamp wasn't hardly playing at all. He kind of fell out of favors with Doc Rivers. Yeah. So a couple little minor deals. It seems like that's where we are at this point.
Yeah, we're at 12:59 p.m., so trade deadline is about to close. Maybe once it officially closes, a couple minutes after, we can start getting into questions.
Yeah, I generally there's a couple of questions or a couple of trades that get announced right after.
Yes,
but it doesn't seem like anything major is cooking, other than looked like Memphis was maybe trying to get in on Kevin Durant. That was the other big rumor today, is that a lot of teams were still calling on Kevin Durant after apparently Phoenix was willing to trade him to Golden State, and I had wondered if maybe a big name like LaMelo Ball would get traded because Charlotte's clearly been sellers so far this deadline, are willing to take on bad contracts with draft picks. I wonder if they would try and get out of it entirely and totally start over and get whatever value they could for LaMelo. But we will see. Again, for something like that to jump up out of nowhere would probably be difficult to do at this point.
So yeah, you were talking about the NBA standings and the Wizards bringing in some players that could potentially help them win games. The Jazz are actually, after their win last night, are down to 28th overall in the league. They were at 29th. The Pelicans, who have had injury problems, and they just traded Brandon Ingram, which is another thing we can talk about affecting the Jazz, are at 12-37. Pelicans 12-39, and the Wizards still 30th at 9-41.
Again, the rule I like to play with this is count their wins. Don't worry about their losses. The Pelicans have just played 2 more games than the Jazz, and because the Jazz lose most of their games, I would expect they lose their next 2, including tomorrow night against Phoenix, and then over the weekend this series as they lead up to the All-Star break. So, yes, the Jazz are technically in a tie because of the win last night with the Pelicans, but I wouldn't worry about that terribly long. I am curious about some of these teams getting better. Like you just mentioned, Toronto acquires Brandon Ingram. Well, Brandon Ingram makes them better, assuming he's going to want to step up and play because he's trying to sign a big contract this offseason. So I would imagine he comes back and plays. And as we've talked about, I think the Raptors are now 8-3 in their last 11 games. Like they are clearly not focused on losing at all costs. So I'm not really worried about them if I'm a Jazz fan and the Jazz ability to catch them. But New Orleans adding Kelly Olynyk, like that's a guy who could actually step in and play a couple of games and win you 3 or 4, especially if Brandon Ingram just simply isn't playing.
True.
That's the hard part for the Pelicans there is they just didn't have anything from Brandon Ingram. They weren't getting anything, and maybe he was going to come back after the trade deadline if he realized he didn't get moved, so he might as well up his value. But, just something to work on there, or something to follow, I guess, there if you're a Jazz fan. Do Bruce Brown and Kelly Olynyk actually end up playing in New Orleans at all? And if so, do they help them win? Because that could dictate who finishes with the worst record in the West, and which might end up being, ultimately, after what Washington's done today, might end up just being the worst record in the NBA.
Yes.
So I think I'd keep an eye on those. The trade deadline has officially passed. I don't think that necessarily means the Jazz are done. There could be some late deals. I will usually get some information on that, and I will let you know as soon as I hear. But looks like the Warriors are done making moves, according to Anthony Slater. Generally, we get an idea when the teams we cover are done for the day.
I will go into the questions under your X post, and we will still keep an eye on if there is any last updates from Shams or anybody else.
Shams, one quick one. James Wiseman, who's been out with an Achilles injury all year, sent to Toronto for cash. And cash to Toronto. So teams are trying to get under the luxury tax. Indiana was kind of close, so any money they can save is good for them. They're trying to re-sign Miles Turner this summer. All right, let's get to the questions.
First from Caleb Manser. How did the value of the Lakers' 2027 first change from the Luka trade, and should we be worried about Phoenix's 2031 pick with their awful trade deadline?
The Jazz pick that they're owed from the Lakers in 2027 definitely got hurt.
Yes.
You would rather a team maybe having LeBron retiring the year before and certainly not having Luka than LeBron retiring and the team having Luka and now having Mark Williams, who I really like that trade for the Lakers. That pick went down in value.
Yes.
No question about it. Significant value. Now, again, you are a Luka injury, which look at the Dallas Mavericks right now, away from that being a, non-playoff team. And I am curious how much the Lakers can actually do to improve their roster in the next couple of years before that pick will realize itself. The hard part for the Lakers is, yes, they have some players right now they can trade, but you don't want to trade away all your pieces right now to get assets because you want to maximize your very tiny window while you have Luka and LeBron and now Mark Williams. So you actually do want to win now. You don't want to just make trades to make trades. You can't be all in on the future.
Yeah.
But they've also traded all their assets. Again, to this point where they traded another first for Mark Williams. That was their other asset they didn't give to Dallas for Luke Williams or for Luka Doncic. They gave it to Charlotte for Mark Williams now. So they don't actually have a ton of easy pathways to get better. As we've learned, you can always make little moves. You can always try and rearrange pieces. But, Dallas traded a bunch of firsts in recent years to build around Luka. The Lakers don't have that.
Yeah.
And they don't really have a way of getting a bunch of firsts. So that's going to be the hard thing for them. And you can always say, well, now that it's the next trade deadline, we can trade the 2032 pick. And then the next trade deadline, you can trade the 2033 pick. You do have to be careful with that because it runs out and it comes time to pay the piper. So the Jazz, if you're a Jazz fan and they hold on to this 2027 pick, you have to essentially hope that Luka has a calf injury or is everything that Nico Harrison says he is and the Mavericks were afraid he is, and he's not healthy enough to play in 2027. And then they just have not built out a roster around him. And, you get the 14th pick. But you were hoping to get the 5th or the 6th or the 7th pick, and that's not going to happen.
Don't get me wrong. I do really like the Mark Williams trade for the Lakers, but I was surprised that they were so hasty with the use of the 2031 pick because the Luka trade was clearly not a win-now move, right?
No, it wasn't. But clearly they felt like they should try with LeBron.
Yes.
And that's probably fair to LeBron.
Which makes sense, 100%. But, they also could have maybe taken a page out of the Phoenix Suns book and traded an unprotected pick for 3 lower picks. But at the end of the day, that's 3 more picks you can use in trades.
Yeah.
But regardless, the 2027 pick is hurt. And Phoenix's awful deadline regarding the 2031 pick, I'd say that is helpful for the Jazz.
That's all good news for the Jazz. Everything Phoenix does wrong is great for the Jazz. And they've been doing nothing but doing things wrong.
Yeah.
They gave up another first. Again, so that they traded Yusuf Nurkic in Charlotte today with a 2026 first-round pick. They could trade that 2026 pick because they acquired the Jazz's 25 and 27 first-round picks. And those picks are the worst, again, of the Jazz, Cleveland, and Minnesota picks. So those are in the late 20s. So that did allow Phoenix to make a deal and get off of bad salary, but they didn't get off of that much salary.
Yeah.
Yusuf Nurkic being off the team, even though Cody Martin, I think, is under contract again next year for some money. It's that seems more like they just hated Yusuf Nurkic, not we've set something up for the offseason. They're going to be able to make this enormous trade. I don't really see that happening at all for them either. So the more disastrous this becomes and their inability to, get a Jimmy Butler or get out of Bradley Beal's contract this year ended up being very positive for the Jazz because the Suns just don't. The older KD gets, the fewer assets you're ever going to be able to trade him for. And you're going to get to that point if you're Phoenix where you're going to have to worry or wonder if you need to trade Devin Booker.
Yep.
That's going to be your only out if KD's 37 and Bradley Beal still has $100 million left on his deal. You're going to fall to the bottom, and that's why the Jazz were saying, okay, we think not only do you fall to the bottom, you don't have the assets to rebuild by 2031, and that pick's going to be worth more than, as we're saying, the 29th pick from the Cavs this year, probably the 25th pick from the Cavs in 2027, and then whatever happens in 2029.
Speaking of Kevin Durant, this is not by any means breaking news, even though it technically is. He just reported that the Suns will not be moving Kevin Durant, so there will not be a last-minute bombshell from this trade deadline. But Kevin Durant, it came out that he did not ask for a trade, which he has done in the past, and it was just sort of the Suns weighing their options, and doing that with a star player a lot of times doesn't end well. So maybe Kevin Durant will be moving on eventually, maybe next offseason or next year, who knows? But like I said, didn't ask for a trade, and they were shopping him anyway, so things are not looking pretty in Phoenix.
No, it's horrible. Being a Phoenix fan right now would be very, very difficult. You're happy right now if you're a Jazz fan, and that's not what you're going through.
Yeah.
Since the trade deadline has passed and we don't have anything breaking, again, it could happen. It's still relatively new, and the league calls go through, and they take a while. Let's talk about the trades the Jazz didn't make.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people were, I had said I thought the Jazz were going to make another move. They did. They traded Dennis Schroeder. We have not seen exactly what is coming out of that, right?
No, not yet.
So the Jazz have traded Dennis Schroeder to the Detroit Pistons, according to everybody on this live call. I'm not able to do as much research as I would like to figure out what exactly happened here. But along those lines, the Jazz have not traded Colin Sexton. Mm-hmm. They have not traded John Collins. They have not traded Jordan Clarkson. We knew they couldn't trade Lauri Markkanen. They did not trade Svi Mykhailiuk. So, this is most of a team.
Yeah.
Still intact. This is almost the exact team we saw for the Jazz to start the year, minus Drew Eubanks and Patty Mills. There's just not a lot of major pieces here that we have seen. And I would bet the Jazz felt pretty comfortable with the fact that they only have 12 wins at this point, and Will Hardy knows how to lose games.
Yeah.
Whether he's done it enough for Jazz fans, they should be satisfied with it, but whether or not he's done it over the first half of the season, after the trade deadlines, each of the last 2 years, he's got a 26% winning percentage. So he has understood the assignment when the Jazz have traded Mike Conley and Jared Vanderbilt, Malik Beasley, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Kelly Olynyk and Ochai Agbaji and all these moves the Jazz have made, Simone Fontecchio last year. He understands when it's losing time and figures out what the Jazz have to do on the floor to get those losses. It's going to be a little trickier actually this year because you do have John Collins and Colin Sexton and Jordan Clarkson still on the roster, we think.
Yes.
Barring anything major here. And I don't think the Jazz are going to buy any of them out because they're all expensive and they're all valuable.
Yes.
I think you hold on to all those guys because worst case scenario, they're just expiring contracts beginning in June or July when you can start making these trades again. But those guys all remain on the roster. And look, Colin's been excellent this year. John Collins, I think, has been the Jazz's best player this year, and Jordan's always been great in Utah. Mm-hmm. You know, Jordan is, and I mean great in Utah. I mean, he loves being in Utah. He has certainly enjoyed his time here and has been a very good teammate. I think if you watched the game last night and you saw the walk-off where Lauren Green is talking to Keontae and talking to Isaiah, and then goes over to Jordan. Jordan's like, you've seen my 31 points before. It's not about me. Let's talk about Walker. Let's talk about these young guys. Jordan understands the assignment as well. He understands what he's doing here and kind of this leadership role that he's undertaken, which I almost felt like he may have done begrudgingly in the past, and I think he's more willingly wrapped his arms around it now.
I think the biggest shock, and again, when we recorded our podcast leading into this NBA season, we were like, we don't know what trades the Jazz are going to make because we don't know what market there is for any of the players. But John Collins has played out of his mind this year. If he made more free throws, he would be a 50, 40, 90 guy. And like you said, he has maybe been the best player when you take into account not only performance but availability and all these other things. I know he had that stretch with an injury for a while, but I feel like his market has never been higher because of how he has played this year.
He's Chandler Holt. I'm Ben Anderson. We're doing a live Utah Jazz NBA trade deadline recap using the KSL Sports Twitter Spaces. So we appreciate everybody who's tuning in. If you're just tuning in, you want to hear all of this, we are doing this on the normal Jazz Notes podcast channel. So you can find that wherever you get your podcast. Just search Jazz Notes. So we are talking about the moves and the lack of moves that the Jazz have made at the trade deadline now. I think one of the things that was interesting, and it probably started with Luka, was that first-round draft picks are just not flying around.
Yep.
Right? Luka got one, or the Lakers had to give up one to Dallas to get him. De'Aaron Fox, it was technically 3, which is why I didn't love that deal. Like, they kind of gave up a lot of firsts for not a lot of firsts flying around. San Antonio paid a pretty decent premium, even though they didn't include young players. They still gave up a lot of picks when no one's going for picks. Brandon Ingram went for 1 pick. Jimmy Butler went for 1 pick. Like, this wasn't Rudy Gobert 4 picks. This wasn't Donovan Mitchell 3 picks. This wasn't some of these big trades that we've seen. Teams are seemingly more hesitant to do that. And I wonder if because of that, the Jazz weren't getting enough draft capital for a John Collins or a Colin Sexton or a Jordan Clarkson to feel comfortable making that move.
Do you think that more or less NBA teams learned from that maybe year or two where picks were just flying around like hotcakes?
No, I don't think anyone learned. I truly think there's such an imbalance right now in draft picks that, like, teams don't have any to trade. Like, we're talking about the Lakers trading their only draft pick.
Yep.
The Suns had to make a pretty dangerous trade with an unprotected 2031 first-round pick, as Justin Zanuck called it, the most valuable trade asset on the market, for 3 low-value firsts. And the Jazz were like, great. But there is such an imbalance with good draft picks for teams that are out there that they're just not a lot to move.
Mm-hmm.
And windows right now in the NBA are so short. Trading anything beyond like what you know your pick is going to be this year, which is the case for Golden State for Jimmy Butler, like, okay, top 10 predicted this year. If Jimmy Butler and Steph go knee to knee in their next practice and can't play, fine, we'll keep our pick in the top 10. But if we make the playoffs, fine, we've paid this debt. We don't have to worry about it hanging over our heads. It's why I actually didn't hate the Bulls trade as they got involved with De'Aaron Fox and sending Zach LaVine to Sacramento. Them getting their control of their first-round pick is valuable. Like, next year, the Jazz have to worry about how many wins they have all year because the pick goes to Oklahoma City.
Mm-hmm.
So unless they're winning 48 games, and that's going to be the 21st pick or 22nd pick, if they're at 12 in the lot, if you're anywhere in the lottery, you might as well be below 8 so it doesn't go to Toronto or to Oklahoma City, excuse me. And if you're risking it being at 8, you have to be down at like 4, so you don't get jumped by enough teams. Again, the Jazz dropped from 8 to 10 last year in the draft. So you really have to be bad. You lose control of your ability to kind of dictate how your season looks. Chicago got out of that by trading Zach LaVine and getting their own pick back from San Antonio. So teams are just getting more and more hesitant to make those types of picks because I think they can come back and haunt you and really dictate how you play your season out. The Jazz are experiencing it right now, and it just times up well with where they are in the rebuild of their franchise. But it's not a fun thing to do, so I think teams are getting more and more hesitant to trade picks, hence maybe the Jazz not getting what they were looking for from some of the veterans that are on their roster.
Still no news on the Dennis Schroeder trade. Of course, we know he is going to Detroit, and I believe Chris Haynes reported that the Pistons are going to keep him. So 4 teams in the past 24 hours for Schroeder, but he finally found his last stop for the season. But still no news regarding what the Jazz got back. If it was anything substantial. Honestly, like, that is a solid pickup for Detroit. Like, Cade Cunningham is your best player, and you get a solid backup option to fill the minutes when he has to sit. But yeah, still no. The last news from Shams is that Kevin Durant will not be moved this year. So maybe that is the end of the trade deadline.
Schroeder was probably going to be, and we'll see if Bruce Brown gets bought out or some of these other pieces, but he was probably going to be the best buyout candidate, the most talented buyout candidate on the board. And if that's the case, you probably want to get something for him, even if it's basically nothing. You want to get anything for him as opposed to just paying him to go away. But you might as well take something in if you can. And again, we'll see. Maybe the Jazz had to unload something to move off the deal and not eat as much of the contract. They may have decided to save money that way. I don't know. We'll have to keep an eye on what that looks like. Again, that report has not come down yet. But yeah, I think that was a smart move for the Jazz, and cutting that salary and getting out of it is fine. And he probably steps in and helps Detroit. Guys like that are valuable. I also do wonder, I wrote about this a little bit last night at KSL Sports when I talked about the Schroeder trade. I wonder if that made it harder to trade Jordan Clarkson. Because if you were going to trade, look, if somebody has the archetype that they want a kind of ball in hand, shot creator who can score a lot but isn't the most consistent guy and isn't like a terrific shooter, 41, 42% from the floor, 35% from three, and they were calling around, if they had called on Jordan, they had probably called on Schroeder as well to see if he was available. And truthfully, Schroeder's a year younger. He is an expiring where Jordan has 1 year left on his deal, and he makes $1 million less. Like, the financials actually make way more sense to trade for Dennis Schroeder. So if the Jazz were convinced they needed to trade Jordan, they probably hurt themselves, and honestly, by getting Dennis first, because that was going to be now the more prioritized player. Now, you could have gone a step further and said, well, actually, Colin Sexton's the best version of those guys, right? Because he shoots 40% from three, and he's way younger, and he has a year left on his deal, but it's still super affordable. They may have just hurt all of their value by landing Schroeder. And that doesn't mean it was a mistake. I think you're going to get an asset out of this, and that ends up being a positive. But if you wonder why Jordan didn't get moved, that might have been part of it.
What do you think was the most shocking part of the trade deadline, specifically for the Jazz? Of course, it wasn't the most active deadline. They didn't get rid of any of the big names that a lot of people speculated they might have. For me, it would be getting rid of Patty Mills.
Yeah, certainly I didn't think that would happen. Just from like an emotional standpoint, they had talked so much about the desire to have him around and set an example for the young guys. That's pretty cold.
Yeah.
That's pretty cold to then send him out. Now, the nice thing is he's like, okay, sell Patty Mills on moving to Los Angeles.
Yeah.
He'd probably be okay. Assuming that the Clippers keep him. They may not. They may waive him and buy him out, and his career could be over at that point. And if the Jazz just want to hire him as an assistant coach, they could. Or maybe he just wants to sail off into the sunset with his wife and do whatever he wants to do. Good for him either way.
Yeah.
But I guess not moving Svi would be just like every team needs shooting.
Yeah.
The Warriors need more shooting right now. The Lakers need more shooting right now. The Orlando Magic did not make a trade. Am I right on that?
Yeah, I think so.
Like, we talked all this last week after seeing them here in Utah, which is a little bit of recency bias, but it's like a team really can't score. And I know they just torched the Kings last night, but they really need shooting. They really need some offensive help, and they didn't do anything that made them better. I didn't see.
Definitely not that made them better. I'm looking at the ESPN trade deadline recap. They did 2 second-round pick swaps.
Okay. Yeah, right, great. And they never make trades.
Yeah.
The Magic are notorious for never making in-season trades. So, a team like that could have just like traded a second for Svi.
Yeah.
And I thought that would have been valuable, which is why I think the Jazz probably signed him in the first place. And again, no problem for the Jazz. He's on a non-guaranteed contract next year, and in perpetuity, they basically own his rights. So you can continue to put this off and not trade him if you want to. And still have the value of having the shooter. But I thought maybe somebody would have been willing to go and get a guy who, you look at his actual percentage this year, it's not crazy high, but if you ever actually watch him, you're like, oh man, this dude gets hot really quickly and is always willing to shoot. I talked about Matt Thomas that the Jazz acquired a couple of years ago from Toronto at the trade deadline, just kind of in that same, like they thought they were contenders. You can always use another shooter to add some spacing. I thought somebody would have done that with Svi, especially because he was on the Celtics championship team last year and might have a little bit of value. But it doesn't look like that got done.
Yeah.
Any more questions that have come on?
Yes. This one from Jacob David Perazzo. With Collins being 27, Sexton being 26, which of the two do you see being a part of the future, with the understanding that Markkanen is also 27?
I think Collins. Am I crazy in thinking it could be John Collins over Colin Sexton?
I don't think that's crazy. I think that if Colin Sexton were to stay around, hopefully it would be as like a backup point guard on a championship level team. The only gripe with Collins is that I don't think him and Walker Kessler, of course it's been a lot better this year because he's
really
actually spacing the floor. But it's just like, are Walker and Collins just on a high this year? I feel like that's a question the Jazz have to ask themselves.
The interesting thing about John, because John has been playing so well this year, is if the Jazz wanted to revisit a Lowry Markkanen trade, there are way worse options than having John Collins still on your roster playing that 4 spot that Lowry is, plays 3-4, whatever, plays in the front court. Like, if you're looking for a guy who can step out and stretch the floor and doesn't need the ball a whole lot, John Collins makes a lot of sense. Like, that's a good insurance plan if you trade Lowry, but you trade Lowry and say, well, we don't want to collapse and fall all the way to the bottom. We still want to have a chance to compete. John being there's not a bad option.
True.
I think John's been better than Lowry this year, at least like production-wise. He's clearly been better than Lowry this year. Lowry faces different defenses, etc. But John's been super productive. So maybe because you have John already under contract for next year, he has the opportunity to opt out, which may motivate you to just renegotiate his contract and try and give him, like I mentioned, 3 years and 60, as opposed to paying him $25 million next year on an expiring deal. And that's kind of a win-win for both sides. And there's just not free agency money out there for him to opt out and go chase anywhere else. That might make a lot of sense. And you can renegotiate Colin as well, don't get me wrong, but you look at the youth the Jazz have, the depth they have in the backcourt already with Keontae George and with Isaiah Collier. And it looks like Isaiah Collier's going to be the starting point guard going forward.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think they would change that this year. And if they're not changing that this year, like, when are they going to change it? And so I think you got to start worrying about the size of your backcourt a little bit. So if Collier is your starting point guard, at least for the rest of the season, like, Colin doesn't make a ton of sense long-term next to him because he's little also. So I think those are the issues. Now, look, if you end up drafting Dylan Harper in the offseason, everybody's up for grabs because he's the number 2 overall pick and he's your point guard of the future, and that's what you're going to rely on. But I think all those questions can still be answered later, which makes sense why the Jazz didn't trade these picks. These guys. They didn't have to necessarily trade them now or risk losing them for nothing. In fact, I don't think they're going to lose any of these guys for nothing now. They've put themselves in a situation to have yet another trade period coming up in June and July to make more deals.
One more little trade update that we can get to another question. Shams reports going back to the Marcus Smart trade that the Wizards are sending Marvin Bagley and Johnny Davis to the Grizzlies as a part of this deal.
Okay. Marvin Bagley, also drafted in front of Luka Doncic, on like his 5th team now. Sacramento, Washington. Was he already in Detroit?
Yes.
He was already in Detroit.
Yep.
Yeah. So now it's his 4th team. So he's bouncing around a little bit.
Next question from Riley O'Brien.
Okay.
If Dylan Harper or Cooper Flagg end up in Utah, would you consider the rebuild a success? Obviously, the players have to pan out, but given all the moves the Jazz have made since Donovan Rudy, doesn't it have to result in a potential superstar?
From where the Jazz were with all of those players to the point where they truly couldn't trade everybody in one offseason.
Yep.
They tried. They got rid of Royce and Rudy and Donovan in one summer, and they still had Mike Conley on the roster going into the next year. To deconstruct all the way, and now, especially because let's say what we know is if you end up with the number 2 overall pick, top 2 pick in this year's draft, and you're still going to have Lowry, John Collins, Colin Sexton, Keontae George, Kyle Filipowski, Taylor Hendricks, Bryce Sensabaugh, Cody Williams, who am I missing, on your roster, you're in really good shape. If you do that, you're in a really good spot. And I think you're going to be thrilled with that if you can get that done. If you have all of those players, you didn't have to completely hit like rock bottom, which some of these teams have done before they get their number 1 overall pick. If you add, I've joked about this on Twitter, it always makes Jazz fans mad, but if you add Cooper Flagg to Lowry Markkanen, John Collins, Walker Kessler, I didn't mention Walker, Keontae George, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. You dropped maybe the best player on the team, on a team that was, as we all know, if they were trying to win every game, would probably be competing for 39 wins this year, 38 wins this year. So I think that's a big part of it. All right, we got some details on the Dennis Schroeder trade.
Yes. So reporting from Jake Fisher, for Dennis Schroeder, the Jazz got KJ Martin, Josh Richardson, and a 2nd-round pick.
So Josh Richardson was just like this weird throw-in from Miami.
Yes.
Originally, KJ Martin was traded yesterday by Philly to, I don't even know, like, was it Detroit? It might have been to Detroit. I'd have to look up where KJ Martin got traded. So this will be the second time KJ Martin has gotten traded in the last couple of days too. Yeah, he was traded to the Pistons yesterday.
Okay.
KJ Martin, kind of a wing defender, not shooting great he is shooting much better this year. 61% from the floor, 38% from the three-point line. Career, he's not that good of a shooter. See what his contract looks like. He has 1 year and $8 million left on his deal. So the Jazz get a, kind of big 3-and-D wing that they can figure out what to do with the summer.
Yep.
I don't think they'd buy him out again when you have a year left on your deal. You don't usually get bought out. It has happened before, but I don't think that would be the case. So this is a guy the Jazz can maybe trade next summer, or he's a guy that you rely on and you use. So the Jazz actually, kind of interestingly, get a real player here. I would think they're going to waive Josh Richardson.
Yes.
That would be my guess, is they'll buy out Josh Richardson. Let me look at his contract.
And another 2nd-round pick. So does that make it 5 at the
5
deadline?
second-round picks, which, again, the Wizards traded 4 second-round picks for a first earlier today. So you basically acquired the equivalent of a first. I don't want to say that exactly. I think the picks the Wizards are sending to Philly are actually pretty valuable.
Yeah.
They're like good seconds if there's such a thing. They are good second round picks. So there's some value in that. Yeah. Looking at this trade, just trying to piece together. Josh Richardson is in the final year of his deal. He's at about $3 million.
Okay.
So technically, let me pull up what the Jalen Hood-Schifino makes. It may just come down to who's cheaper.
True.
To who they buy out.
Yeah.
Which, at that point, you really can't blame them. Josh Richardson, though, is going to be expiring. He's not going to have any value. Jalen Hood-Schifino has $4 million or has $3.8 million left. So Josh Richardson's cheaper.
Yeah.
So I would almost guarantee the Jazz waive Josh Richardson,
Okay.
buy him out, save, because you've already played 2/3 of the season, you only have to pay him a third left of their contract. Save $200,000 as opposed to JHS, and then you bring Jalen Hood-Schifino in, you let him play. And KJ Martin probably plays.
Yeah, I think so as well.
KJ Martin's I'm not going to pretend he's like this great player, but he's probably a guy that Jazz audition and see if they like. And again, if worst case scenario, you build up his value and then redirect him in this offseason, you have the ability to do that. He was a second round pick by the Kings in 2020 in that weird COVID draft that was such a nightmare. And it's turned into an okay player. As we mentioned, career 33% 3-point shooter, but this year has jumped that up to 38%. He's only played 24 games.
So let's combine all of the Jazz's trade into one trade.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea.
So,
Thank you.
The Jazz trade Drew Eubanks, a player who we have said for a long time probably already planned to trade when they signed him in the last offseason, and then a glorified assistant coach in Patty Mills.
With all due respect to our friend Patty, who was very nice to us.
Patty is an amazing person. For two players, assuming that they waive Josh Richardson, in KJ Martin and Jalen Hood-Schifino, that, like you said, may take a flyer on them, right? See if they want to give them an audition for the actual team, and 5 second-round picks.
KJ Martin, 5 second-round picks. Sorry, I'm setting this out as a tweet as well. I'm just stealing your content and putting my name on it on Twitter.
Okay.
5 second-round picks, and likely either Jalen Hood-Schifino or who did we talk about? Josh Richardson. Josh Richardson. I'm going back to my dunk contest days of 2011. Yeah, that's great work.
Yes.
In all honesty, it's very good work. And Ryan Smith's going to have to pay a couple $1 million in buyouts, I'm sure. They already paid Mo Bamba to go away, right? So it's gonna. I'm sure Ryan from KSL, Ryan Smith hears this and is like, yeah, real cheap for me. It's like, yeah, he actually has to pay for these things. But that's a very good trade deadline for the Jazz. As you mentioned, Drew Eubanks and Patty Mills outgoing for KJ Martin, 5 second-round picks, and either, and most likely, Jalen Hood-Schifino.
One more question under your X post. What was the Jazz's purpose of getting Schroeder? It doesn't seem like they got anything for trading him back away. This was an older reply, so we know what they got now. Maybe I'm missing something more. So what was the Jazz's purpose in getting him?
Yeah, I think to acquire more assets, and they did that today. In fact, they got a pretty good asset for him.
True.
This is so you people have heard the red button theory, which is some guy on Craigslist, when Craigslist used to be the Facebook Marketplace, had a red button and posted it on Facebook Marketplace and traded it for like a staple and then or whatever, a paperclip, and eventually traded it for a ranch, and I think he eventually traded the ranch for a Porsche. Like, he just kept winning little trades, win every little trade. And the Jazz just did that in an extraordinarily abbreviated 96-hour period starting on Saturday morning when they traded Drew Eubanks and Patty Mills for what was ultimately a second-round draft pick.
Yeah.
They traded for 1 second-round draft pick in the expiring contract of P.J. Tucker, which turned into Dennis Schroeder, which turned into KJ Martin, and then added some picks in there. So it's good work. If you could do that, like if you did that with let's say you did that with Walker Kessler, like you would end up with Luka Doncic at the end. Like that's the incremental increase in value that the Jazz got from Drew Eubanks to KJ Martin and 5 second-round picks would be the equivalent of, turning Walker into, a superstar right now in the NBA. Now, it's harder to do that at the top level. It's easier to nickel and dime guys like this, but it's really good work from Justin Zanuck and Danny Ainge. It really is how you put yourself in a spot to have future versatility, which we've talked about in 2020, 2021. The Jazz just lacked versatility. They did not have an ability to make moves, to push themselves over the top with that team. And the same thing happened in 2008 when they had Darren Williams and Carlos Boozer and Mehmet Okur, and they kind of were stuck with Andre Karolinko's contract, and they just couldn't make the other move to get over the top. You're just trying to make sure that when you're back and competitive, you have the opportunity to make more moves. And honestly, these picks could be a part of that when they start to get realized coming up in the future.
That's something I was going to say is I feel like a lot of Jazz fans might be like, oh, big whoop, a bunch of second-round picks. But this is something we talked about, specifically you said on our last Jazz Notes podcast episode, which was these second-round picks, maybe you don't even use them and they can just be used for cost-cutting moves to get below one of the aprons, or it just gives you so many more opportunities from a front office standpoint, and not necessarily to attach with a player to upgrade, but just for so many other things.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
I think it's been a good trade deadline for the Jazz. I think there will be Jazz fans who are disappointed that you didn't move on from John Collins and Colin Sexton or Jordan Clarkson. And look, that could come to fruition if, 3 months from now, I guess 2 months from now when the season ends, the Jazz have jumped up to 25 wins that are picking 7th again.
Yep.
And if KJ Martin and John Collins and Jordan Clarkson and Lauri Markkanen, you couldn't trade Lauri this year, are the reasons you're winning all these games, that would be a blow to the Jazz. This year was about trying to get one of those top 2 or 3 picks. The nice thing is they still have put themselves in the position to do that. It's going to have to get awkward. I'm sorry, you have to lose your shame. If you want to end up with a really high draft pick this year, you're going to have a little bit of shame and just say, we're just resting a healthy John Collins. Nobody's playing on the second night of back-to-backs. Kyle Filipowski is starting over everybody. Maybe KJ Martin plays a little bit here and you never see Svi Mikhailiuk again in a Jazz uniform. But you're going to have to get over your shame of well, it's obvious what we're doing tanking. Right, it is obvious.
Yep.
But if you add, so you mentioned Dylan Harper or an Ace Bailey or a Cooper Flagg to this team, it gets pretty interesting pretty quickly.
Yes.
Or you can go back and make more trades this summer. But I think that's going to be the approach for the rest of the year for the Jazz. How long did we go?
We're at 46 minutes on the podcast episode.
Okay. I'm sure it was a little sloppy.
Yeah.
Live radio can be. And then when it's live radio following trades, it always gets extra hairy. Really appreciate everyone who follows us, as always, on Twitter at Ben's Hoops, at Holt Sports. You can also get us at Blue Sky there. Reads us at KSLSports.com or was listening in the Twitter spaces here, replied to my prompt sending in questions. We'll have a better, fuller view of this coming up on Monday when we record our next Jazz Notes podcast. Find us there. Listen, appreciate everyone who tuned in, and happy trade deadline.
We didn't fall for any NBA Centel posts.
We didn't.
Good for us.
No, we didn't get any bad fake shams posts. So good for us. All right, we'll talk to you again coming up on Monday.